Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for the annual Yale Alumni Academy Climate Change Conversation Series. Today is our last presentation for this year's series. We'd like to give all of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves using the chat. Please tell us your name, your Yale affiliation, where you're zooming in from, and what brings you here tonight. And since today is our last session, it would also be great if you could let us know how many of this year's webinars you have tuned into. This chat transcript will also be given to Dr. Anisfeld at the conclusion of our meeting so we can see everyone who is here this evening. We've got Don Critchell, thank you for joining us this evening. From Kroonemaker at Yale Forestry Studies, class of '82. Kate Gearhart, Yale class of '88. We have Nikki, class of '78, PhD in environmental anthropology. Thank you for joining us this evening. Dean Lindsay, School of Divinity, class of '86. Recent work in churches in the Republic of Kiribati. Liz Shriver, her husband, John Blake, is from class of '60 and law school in '64. Thank you for joining us. Bob Kroonemaker is saying this is his third seminar in the series. Thank you so much for being with us these 3 times. Janet Shapiro, physician, Yale class of '81. So wonderful to see so many different disciplines represented. Tim Wood, board member for a public company interested in sustainability. That's fantastic. All right, while the rest of you continue to introduce yourselves, I'm going to get ready to introduce our speaker. We're going to try something a little different this evening. Usually we save all the questions for the end of the presentation. Today, in the spirit of encouraging academic dialogue, we're going to take breaks for questions at different intervals. So please make sure you submit your questions using the Q&A feature, which is the button right to the left of the chat from the bottom. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Shimon Anisfeld, who is known to his students and colleagues as Shimmy. He sees himself as an educator first and researcher second. Dr. Anisfeld has 3 primary areas of interest: freshwater management, coastal ecosystems, and synthetic organic pollutants. These interlinked topics have driven his teaching and research at Yale over the last 2 decades, including his 2010 book, Water Resources, his forthcoming water management textbook, and research on the response of salt marshes to sea level rise and other stressors. Besides courses in coastal ecology, water management, and organic pollutants, Dr. Anisfeld also teaches physical science foundations for environmental managers. He sees water issues as central to the challenges facing the world in the coming decades and hopes to train environmental professionals who are well equipped to face these challenges. Today, we will be discussing what happens when a society built around a certain level of water availability finds itself facing climate change-induced megadrought. What happens when stormwater infrastructure designed to handle the 100-year storm is faced with sea level rise and more intense flood events? This talk will discuss the ways that climate change is affecting the hydrologic cycle and the ways that planners and water managers are adapting to those changes. 2 themes will be central to this evening's conversation. First, variability. Floods and droughts, sometimes in close succession, are manifestations of the inherent variability of the hydrologic cycle, and variability that is being amplified by climate change. Our tools for understanding variability are rooted in using the past as a guide to the future. What do we do when we expect the future to be different from the past? The second theme is resilience. The damage done by a flood or drought is a function not just of the physical event, but also where and how we live and work. Climate change is uncovering long-standing vulnerabilities in our water management systems, indeed in our patterns of development. Can we adapt in ways that increase our resilience both to climate change and to other stressors? Thank you, Dr. Anisfeld, for being with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. A pleasure to be here. And I recognize some of the names of people who are here, some YSE or FES alums. So welcome to everyone. Okay, I hope I of course, wrote that description well before I prepared the talk. So I hope I'm going to hit on most of those themes. But I'm going to do it in 4 sections. So first, just some foundations that we need to move forward, some kind of basic assumptions, and then talk about flooding and drought in 3 sections. Okay. Before I do that, I want to introduce myself a little more just by kind of talking about my 2 main areas of interest. I know that I mentioned 3 in the intro. The left is one of my research sites at Barn Island in eastern Connecticut, where salt marshes are migrating into forests. A really interesting interface there, where you can see the salt marsh grasses because of sea level rise kind of moving into this upland ecosystem. And then on the right is my forthcoming book on water management, which is a lot of the teaching that I do. And I have a website that I'm developing that's going to be resources to go with the book that I hope will help people around the country and around the world who teach water management, because I think, as the intro said, I do think that's a really important topic. Okay, so foundations. So just kind of 4 points that I want to make before we really get into the topic of flooding and drought. The first is just context here, and I think we all understand this context in different ways, but to me at least, this is a picture of the Holocene, the last 12,000 years or so, where we had a period of kind of pretty stable sea level, pretty stable CO2 in the atmosphere, and then this great acceleration, the Industrial Revolution. Of course, seeds were laid long before that for that change, but rapid increase in CO2, rapid increase in population, rapid increase in our footprint in all different ways on the landscape. And we're starting to realize, I think, that acceleration can't go on forever. We need a transition to a more sustainable way of living on the planet. And that transition also needs to take into account the fact that our current systems of dividing the benefits and costs of environmental management are really unjust. And we need to ensure that justice is part of that transition as well. And water plays an important role in this. I think water, as both a basic human right, a basic component of ecosystem health, is critical to both the justice and the sustainability components. And I put this graph up here, which is just global water use over the last 120 years, just to show that we're starting to bend the curve here. So there's an acceleration in global water use, but we've kind of learned to, even though population is still increasing, we've learned to use less water per person. And so that curve of water use is starting to level off. And I think that's a model for other sectors as well. So that's my first kind of foundational concept here. Second, if we turn specifically to water, is to realize that, and the intro pointed out that variability is critical to this conversation. So we start with spatial variability, the idea that people on this webinar are in places all over the world, or at least all over the US. And depending where you are, you've got different water problems. One way to look at that is just to look at this aridity index, which we can go into the technical details of what that is. But basically, what we're highlighting here are drylands, areas that don't generate a lot of runoff, deserts and semi-arid regions. And of course, in white, we have areas that are wetter, and those have very different types of problems. And the second piece of that is that these water problems are mostly local, right? So if you're living in a very dry region, even if you're living in a Western state in the US, the fact that there's lots of water in the East doesn't really help you. We can't really move water around that much. Now, we've done that. We have moved water large distances, but we've realized the shortcomings of that. And there's always been a limitation on the scale of that, right? So we're not going to solve all our water problems by moving water from wet places to dry places. That makes water problems inherently kind of local. And there's one very important exception, which is there is a lot of water that moves around the world in the form of virtual water, by which I mean mostly food. So when we're trading food around the world, we're trading the water that it took to grow that food. It's similar to the carbon footprint. This is the water footprint. And I just thought I'd share with you, just as a taste of kind of the research that's being done in this area, this image of the global virtual flows, not just of water generally, but of groundwater depletion, water that specifically comes from overusing groundwater. So the way you read this, for example, if you look at the purple, the USA, right? So the US is overusing a lot of our aquifers. New York Times has had a great series on this, people may have followed. And we use that to some extent to grow food for ourselves, but we also export some of that food. So we export that food to China, we export that food to Mexico. Of course, Mexico is also in green, in that down here in this green, is also overusing its aquifers and exporting some of that food to us. So you can see these flows of water around the world. They're not actually flows of water, they're flows of food which took water to grow. Pakistan and India, Iran, all large groundwater depleters and exporters of that virtual water. Okay, so that's the exception. Water problems are local, but food trade in particular does lend a global element to these virtual water movements. Third piece, which is really where we get to the flood and drought conversation, is about temporal variability, right? And we all know this. Where I am, it was a sunny day, but yesterday was rainy. So there's that kind of trivial level of variability. And there's also much longer term levels of variability, which means that our water supply is fundamentally susceptible to this variability. And you could say that kind of when you're thinking about water management, the average water availability in a region really matters less than what the range is, what the variability is. And this is a very practical implication, which again, I'm trying to throw in here some images for you to chew on a little bit. This is an analysis of how much reservoir storage you need to build. Why do you build reservoir storage? Why do we build dams and reservoirs? Well, it's to store water from when we have it to when we need it, right? So it's inherently related to that variability. And what this is, just illustrating is the greater the variability in that inflow, in the amount of water you have coming in, the more storage you need. We can look more at this if people are interested, but that's kind of the fundamental point here. I was aware that people are all over the world, but everyone I think has been in New Haven at some point, right? You're all Yale alums. So I thought I would, I don't know how well people remember New Haven. Some of you are still living there, but I thought I'd use the Mill River as kind of a little bit of a thread running through this, since you're all familiar with it somewhat. So here's New Haven with its three rivers, the West, Mill, and Quinnipiac. And I want to kind of highlight in particular the Mill River and the Whitney Dam, which creates this reservoir called Lake Whitney, just north of campus. And we'll come back to that throughout the talk a little bit. This is a picture of land use in the Mill River watershed. And you can see down at the mouth, New Haven, Fairhaven, the Fairhaven neighborhood, highly urbanized. Other parts of the watershed less so, but still a pretty urban watershed, especially for one that's used as a water supply. Okay, so that's our context. And this is just to kind of use the Mill River to illustrate that temporal variability that we're talking about, right? So this is 7 years of flow from the Mill River, just to illustrate that we have this seasonal variability. It's always dry in the summer in the Mill River. Why is that? It's not really because there's less rain in the summer. It's just because there's more evapotranspiration, right? So trees, plants are using the water. There's less water in the river. That's kind of the natural cycle of rivers in Connecticut. So you could see, I hope people can see my cursor. You can see this is summer, 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 summer. Summer is the low flow time of year. But some summers are a lot lower than others. And we had this kind of weird oscillating pattern where in 2020, we had a very dry summer. 2021 was much wetter. 2022 was really dry. And 2023 was really wet. So we've had this kind of back and forth. And then, of course, we have individual events here, right? These spikes are storm events that suddenly bring a lot of water. So again, variability in water supply at different timescales. And then the last kind of foundational piece, and then I'll stop briefly to take a few questions, is to kind of think about climate change impacts on the hydrologic cycle broadly, and then we'll apply that in the context of flooding and then drought. And this is going to be a one-slide summary of a huge amount of research that has been done on this topic. And I like this kind of mantra that I don't know who said this first, but it's pretty common in my world to say climate change is hydrologic change. The main way that most people are going to experience climate change is through changes in precipitation. Of course, temperature changes too, but the real the harder part for us on some level is going to be changes in flooding and drought, changes in water availability. That has lots of components. Some of the components are pretty simple to understand. In a warmer world, there's less water stored as glaciers, right? So in areas that depend on glaciers as water storage, those are going to start melting. They are melting. That leads to kind of a short-term pulse of downstream water availability, but then long-term less water available. And kind of same thing, this is where in places like California, where seasonal snowpack is a really important kind of natural water reservoir. Clearly, there's going to be more of that precipitation is going to come as rain rather than snow. It's going to be earlier spring snowmelt, less natural storage in the form of snow. This is not so much a freshwater problem, but the coastal problem of sea level rise driven by two main things, ocean warming and ice loss. And that clearly has a flooding effect at the coast. Similarly, really, this is really a coastal effect, although hurricane precipitation can extend pretty far inland. Warming means essentially that we can have more intense hurricanes. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have more hurricanes. There's been a lot of back and forth research on that. The consensus at this point, with a lot of uncertainty around it, seems to be that there aren't necessarily going to be more hurricanes, but we're going to have a shift towards relatively more intense hurricanes. But it's not quite as simple as every part of the world seeing, the same changes because of changes in global circulation, the Hadley cell, other things that drive global circulation. We're pretty confident that some areas are going to see more precipitation, others are going to see less. Identifying specifically which areas is a little trickier. I'll show you an image later that tries to get at that. But broadly speaking, a warmer world means a world with more evaporation, right, and more precipitation. So this has been called an intensification of the hydrologic cycle. Water evaporates more quickly. That means there's more moisture in the atmosphere, which means there's more precipitation, but that then evaporates more quickly. So that cycling is more rapid. One of the implications of that is during dry periods, you can accelerate to a drought pretty quickly because of that loss of water to evapotranspiration. And at the same time, the maximum intensity of storms is larger because the atmosphere holds more moisture. So another way of saying that is that variability that has been a feature of the water cycle all along is only getting more intense, is only increasing. This is, people may be aware, I don't know if other speakers have talked about this, the 5th National Climate Assessment is being released now. So I'm just going to show you a couple. This is the US National Climate Assessment. Show you a couple images from that, which illustrate some of this. So sea level rising almost everywhere, except in places where the land is subsiding, like in Alaska. Annual precipitation, different patterns, right? So in the West, we're generally getting, where we're already fairly dry, we're getting drier. In the East, we're getting wetter. But heavy precipitation increasing almost everywhere. Not quite everywhere, but almost everywhere, right? So the extremes getting more extreme. I will just pause and say that I'm talking about climate change as if it's one thing, but of course the degree of climate change is very much dependent on, our behaviors collectively over the next few decades, whatever time period you're thinking about. And so the amount of warming, the ultimate, the point at which we kind of level off, the ultimate amount of CO2 in the atmosphere really makes a huge difference in terms of the magnitude of these effects. Okay, I'll stop there for a quick question session. And I don't know if I guess I'll stop share and
Just a quick reminder to everyone to please post your questions in using the Q&A feature. It makes it easier for us to keep track and mark which ones we have answered as we go. We do have one question from Gary Grimm. It says, can we retrofit existing systems and structures to adapt to climate change induced problems in a timely and cost-effective manner? And what government or nonprofit organizations should be involved?
Okay, that's a big question, and I might say let's hold that until we've talked a little bit about the more specifics of the systems that do need to adapt. It's a really good question, but can we come back to that one and just see if there are any others kind of more broadly on the broad points? And if not, maybe I should just give people a little more to chew on before we stop for questions.
Okay, Thomas McHenry is asking, he's saying people often ask him, are there any benefits to climate change? Is there any place in the world where it's, perhaps that imbalance is actually benefiting a particular region?
Yeah, I mean, this is not so much my field, but there's certainly winners from climate change, areas that are too cold that are getting warmer, areas that are too wet that are getting a little drier. But kind of, I think broadly speaking, from a water perspective, the winners are going to be those who are able to adapt to the changes in the hydrologic cycle. Because there aren't going to be a lot of places where the climate really becomes, just from a water perspective, not a temperature perspective, really becomes much more favorable for agriculture or for cities. The increased variability that's the real driver that I'm talking about here is kind of bad for everyone on some level. So I would say, yeah, it's more about who can kind of take advantage of that. And I know you might think I'm talking about like take advantage of that in terms of green energy. Certainly that's a factor. But what I mean a little more is who can adapt their agricultural practices, their land use practices to better manage this variability.
Great, thank you. Now, Wake Smith is asking, I said, did I hear you say correctly that sea level is rising most everywhere except where land is subsiding? And wouldn't subsidence increase sea level rise? There's actually a couple people asking a similar question.
Yeah, I misspoke clearly. So areas where land is subsiding, like in the Mississippi Delta in Louisiana, we have very high rates of sea level rise. The areas where we're seeing low rates of sea level rise or negative sea level rise, sea level fall, are places where the land had previously been compressed by glaciers and they're now recovering. So sorry about that. I did misspeak. Alaska is a classic example. Hudson Bay, if you go to Canada, there's a gauging station in Hudson Bay, which is seeing like 9 millimeters a year of sea level fall. It's not that sea level is really falling, it's that the land is recovering from the pressure of the glaciers at a very rapid rate. Remember that glaciation ended about 20,000 years ago, but the land is still recovering from that pressure. That's called glacial isostatic adjustment. So thank you for that correction.
Thank you for the clarification. John is asking, what about river level rise? How are so many cities on rivers coping with higher water levels?
Okay, so river level rise, so that's flooding, which will let me then switch to talking about that, and that's exactly one thing I want to talk about. I guess I should just answer that more directly by saying, while sea level rise is sort of continuous in an age of warming waters and increased ice from Antarctica and Greenland and glaciers going into the ocean, sea levels continually rising pretty much, with some dips here and there because of El Nino and La Nina effects. Rivers are much more dynamic, right? Rivers really depends on, whether you have a rain or drought, whether you have a big flood event or a drought. So that's kind of where I want to get to now. So let me move back to that. That's okay. Okay, are we back here? Okay, so I want to talk about flooding in two parts. First, talk about the hazard, and then talk about exposure, which I'll define a little more as we go along. But first, maybe the most important thing to say is that floods are among the most damaging natural disasters. And I put natural disasters in quotation marks because they are, to a large extent, anthropogenic disasters. How we manage water, how we manage rivers very much affects the impact of a given amount of precipitation, say. So calling them natural disasters is probably not quite right. This is, again, from the recent National Climate Assessment for the US, but it's based on a NOAA database of billion-dollar disasters. So any disaster that individually causes $1 billion of damage is in this database. And this is just counting the number of events of different types. So, clearly you can have winter storms, you can have droughts, you can have tornadoes, stuff like that. What I'm most interested in here are the flooding events in blue and the tropical cyclones, essentially the hurricanes in yellow. And these are a minority of the events, I'll say, but they are the most damaging type of events. So this is the same database, and I just kind of collated data here to try to highlight the difference between these flood events and other kinds of disasters. Two categories of flooding, again, inland flooding, which is essentially river level rise mostly. It's mostly river flooding, but it also would include like an intense rain event, like flash flooding, not necessarily near a river. And then coastal storms driven mostly by hurricanes. So these are a minority of the events, but they really do cause, most of the fatalities and most of the damage, right? Because these are large, kind of generational in some cases. I think Katrina in New Orleans, these are large, really significant events that can do a huge amount of damage. And so going directly to the climate change aspect of this, given what I said before about variability, of course, climate change is expected to exacerbate flooding. But there are a lot of other factors, and this is from the IPCC. People have probably, in other talks in this series, I'm sure people have shown some IPCC graphics, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. AR6 just is the most recent assessment report, the 6th assessment report. So lots of different factors contributing here to flood severity. I want to just kind of talk about a few of these one at a time. So of course, as we said, a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, which kind of fuels heavier precipitation. So that's a positive, double positive. They're ranking it impact on the size of floods. At the same time, the issues we talked about in terms of the cryosphere, in terms of frozen water, also have an effect here. So earlier spring snowmelt would increase river flow, stuff like that. We have the effects of land use change, which can be really important in some areas where in urban areas, all this impervious surface where we don't have soils, where water runs off directly can really increase flooding, right? So there's the climate change impact on the rain event, but of course that rain event, before it hits people, before it hits the river, often travels over the landscape, and what that landscape looks like is really important. And what we've done is we've taken areas that are pervious where water can infiltrate and paved them over, short-circuited the hydrologic cycle and taken water directly to the river often, which means greater flat river flows, flashier river systems. There's a complex of other anthropogenic effects, which are not about climate change, but about land use change, about aerosol pollution, about water use, which can have actually really complicated effects on both rainfall and what happens to rivers. Okay, so that's those up there. And then, of course, sea level rise, that's the simplest on some level. That's unidirectional. We know sea levels rising in most of the US, most of the world. That leads to more flooding. Okay. What I want to turn to now is talk a little bit about how we have managed rivers for flooding and for other purposes, and think about how that actually has made the problem worse on some levels, on some level. So there's certainly a climate change impact, and I don't want to ignore that, but I want to push us to think a little more about the things that we can do anyway, right? And one of those things is think about how we manage rivers. And so I'm just going to show you some examples of how in the US we tend to manage our large river systems, most notably probably the Mississippi River system, but others as well. So what we want to do as, you know, when I say we, I'm really talking in most cases about the Army Corps of Engineers, which manages the Mississippi River system. What they want to do is narrow the system so that it is better for navigation. We want to simplify the system. So you could see this change over time from a river that kind of has this complex network of channels and islands and wetlands to a system that's much narrower and simpler and really disconnected from its floodplain. Okay, so that's sometimes called river channelization, river improvement. The idea is, again, to carry boats and barges more readily, but also to carry floodwater more readily. That's often combined, or almost always combined, with levees. These are riverside building up of the riverbanks, essentially. And you can see how these have dramatically expanded over time. We've been using levees along rivers to keep rivers in their channel for over 100 years in the Mississippi. But those have changed from levees that were overtopped fairly regularly to levees that are meant to never be overtopped, that are much larger, that are meant to really control what's called the project flood, the largest possible flood we can think of. And those levees are meant to protect riverside communities from flooding. But there's a lot of evidence that they actually have this contradictory effect, that they actually increase flooding, both upstream and downstream. The upstream effect is simply because they create a choke point. So they you've narrowed the river, you've prevented it from spreading out. So that essentially serves as a little bit of a barrier to water movement, the narrowing of the river system, which means that water levels rise upstream. And then, of course, downstream, what happens is all the water that used to spread out over the floodplain during large flood events is now in the river. And it doesn't have access to the floodplain because the levees have blocked that off. Okay, so that's not what levees were supposed to do, right? But that turns out is part of what they do. The other thing that is part of this kind of complex of river engineering is revetments, and this is an amazing operation that the Army Corps has in the Mississippi to basically build and install these concrete mats called revetments that are meant to replace the riverbed and banks. So these are kind of built on this barge and kind of shoveled off into the river. And that's to keep the river in place, because rivers naturally are dynamic. When we narrow them and disconnect them from their floodplain, they want to move. We don't want that to happen. Okay, so that's the complex of activities that we do. And I think you could see how this might damage a river ecosystem, but you might need a little convincing that it actually increases flooding. So luckily, there's a really good study that looked at Mississippi River flooding, the extreme flood events, looked at the 100-year flood, and kind of showed that actually what we've done in terms of river engineering has led to an increase in the magnitude of those floods. You can look over here on the right side and just, this is kind of a summary of the data. They actually went back and were able to reconstruct large floods for the last 500 years and found that floods were much larger in the modern period. Some of that has to do with climate change, has to do with increased precipitation, essentially. But a lot of it is not that. And this difference here is the effect of levees and river channelization has made the magnitude of floods higher. Then, of course, there are the cases where levees fail. And this is Katrina. This is the 17th Street Canal and the failure of that flood wall, which people may be familiar with. Just a engineering failure that exacerbated, amplified the magnitude of what would have, in any case, been a large flood event. This made it much, much worse. And one way to think about this is if the flood wall hadn't been there, people would not have counted on it for safety, and they wouldn't have been living, or they wouldn't have stayed anyway, so low relative to the river. So the flood wall in the end did more harm than good by putting people in harm's way. And of course, dam failures too. And this is from Libya, from Derna a few months ago, Storm Daniel, which people may have followed. This large rain event destroyed 2 dams, which then pushed a flood of water, a large wall of water downstream, and really had devastating effects on the city of Derna. These dams were poorly maintained. You can tell that in the left photo, the before photo, and in the after photo, you can see totally destroyed. Which gets us back to the Lake Whitney Dam. Again, I thought I'd try to bring this back to New Haven where I can, and just point out that the Lake Whitney Dam, which I showed you earlier, is an old dam. It's over 150 years old, and not only that, but we don't really know what it's made of exactly. There aren't good plans of what the dam looks like. It's been modified over the years in various ways, but there's been no really kind of modernization of that. It's about 43 feet high. And what this image is meant to show you is the areas that would be flooded in a flood event where the dam failed. And that's a possibility given the age of the dam. And this, I don't know how many of you lived in East Rock neighborhood, but I show this to my students, and a lot of them live in these houses. So they're in the dam breach inundation zone, and not necessarily aware of that as renters or even as homeowners. People aren't told that they're in a dam breach inundation zone. So the Regional Water Authority, which manages this dam, is undergoing a rehabilitation project estimated at $20 to $60 million to bring this dam up to basically a safe level. So that's all kind of the problems. And I want to just close this section. How's my timing here? Not too bad. Close this section by pointing to what I think of as at least part of the solution here, which is green infrastructure. And again, in the New Haven context, the city, together with the Urban Resources Initiative, URI, part of the Yale School of the Environment, has invested heavily in these small-scale decentralized bioswales. And you can see on the left the diagram of how they're supposed to work. On the right, you can see one being installed. They also need to be maintained. I spent some time this summer with incoming Yale School of the Environment students in our mod session, our introduction to our orientation. And one of the things we did was clean out some of these bioswales. They tend to get choked with invasive plants and with sediment and trash, so they do need to be maintained. But when they're working right, they can essentially put water back into the ground, slow down the movement of water across the landscape, and kind of undo some of these effects of impervious surface, of more intense rain events, and of river engineering. Okay, so that's maybe a good place to take a couple questions. Permeable concrete, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we have 2 people asking questions. Richard Roller and an anonymous submission asking what accounts for lower consumption per capita and how much impact can individual versus collective efforts change the trajectory?
So, okay, so this goes back to my, let me just make sure I know. Yeah, so this goes back to one of my earlier slides, I believe. Let's just go here and. So this picture here, right? So this on the bottom right, what I'm suggesting is that our global water use has not quite leveled off, but has the rate of increase has slowed even while population growth continues. And the question is, what accounts for that? So we've gotten, I mean, I think the broad answer is we figured out ways to do the same with less water. Actually, in my last set of slides, when we talk about drought, I have a little more on this. Yeah, but the short answer is we have water efficient fixtures. We have a drip irrigation that is able to grow food with less water. We have ways of, in industrial recycling of water. That's the technological answer. There's also an underlying, of course, institutional and economic answer, right? In certain situations, we've built institutions that are motivated to reduce water use. Okay, so there's the surface aspect to this, which is we have good technology that can solve these problems, and then there's the deeper aspect, which is how do we incentivize that? And I'll just say like two more words on that, which is that generally water is pretty cheap, right? So one thing that a lot of water economists think is we really need to increase the price of water in a time of water scarcity so that people use water more efficiently. And we've started to do that in certain situations, but we still keep water prices artificially really low. So people don't necessarily have that price signal. At the same time, we're building institutions, whether those are, municipal institutions, state, interstate, federal, international institutions, which allocate water rights and incentivize people to stay within those rights. So there's a lot there, but I think that's the overall answer. Yeah, and then Elizabeth, I'm just kind of looking at the most recent comment here. Yeah, of course, that's complicated because we don't want to price anyone out of water, given that water is a human right and should be a human right. So how you balance that with the need for water to be more expensive is really tricky, but I'm confident there are ways to do that, and there are utilities that are doing that in really great ways, and there are utilities that are doing that in really bad ways. And there are lots of institutional and legal constraints that make it hard to do, but not impossible. I'm happy to talk more about that, but maybe we should move to another question. Maybe we can talk more about that at the end. People are interested.
Deborah's asking if you could please explain the significance of 100-year flooding.
Right. Okay. So I'm throwing around this term 100-year flood like everyone knows what that is, right? So that's probably worth some explanation. So it's a way of talking about variability in river systems, right? River flows, are variable over time. What we're talking about are large flood events where we have a lot of rain over a short period of time, and it kind of runs off the landscape, especially if the landscape has been paved, right? And we have very high water levels in the river. The 100-year flood is meant to represent the flood that every year has a 1% chance of reaching that level or higher. We call it the 100-year flood kind of for convenience, but a lot of people think that that's not a good idea because to the layperson, it may sound like it happens every 100 years like clockwork. So if I just had one, I don't have to worry for another 99 years. That's, of course, not how it works. I like to tell my students it's like rolling a die, and that's kind of the easiest way to think about it. If you roll a die, your chances of getting a 6 are 1 in 6. Right? So if you roll a die 600 times, you'll probably get about 100 6s, right? But if you roll a die once and you get a 6, the next time you could get another 6. You can get 3 6s in a row, right? So it's kind of that idea. It's just random distribution of different events. So that's what the 100-year flood is meant to represent. And what this is trying to show here is that the magnitude of that event has increased. The units on the left here are thousands of cubic meters per second. Okay, so a flow rate in this river, this is a large river, so it's a very high flow rate. That has increased partly because of climate, but largely because of other changes, specifically river engineering.
Thank you. Alice Chang is asking, what can we learn from ancient civilizations about how to achieve and maintain sustainability? For example, Vinicius in the 14th century BCE was already writing about the effects of population pressure on the environment, and yet pre-industrial China somehow managed to support intense urbanization without completely denaturing the environment.
Yeah, so that's a broad question that goes beyond water, of course. But I can tell you a little bit about how I think about that from a water perspective. So with you mentioned China, and China has, of course, especially the Yellow River Valley has been dealing with flooding for millennia. And the ability of different Chinese dynasties to manage flooding on the Yellow River was a big factor in their survival. So there is a lot of history here. Some of it successful, some of it not successful. I don't think that just because, we look to the past for good examples, but just because something was done in the, I don't believe that everything we're doing in the modern era is great, but I also don't believe that everything that was done 100 or 1,000 years ago was great either, right? There are successes and failures in any society. So in Chinese society, for example, in Yellow River management in particular, there's been a back and forth over the millennia between the idea that we can keep the river in its channel through levees and the idea that we have to let it flood. And the more successful efforts seem to have been those that let it flood, rather than trying to keep it in its channel. And there's even kind of the mythic figure of Yellow River management is Yu the Great, who his great innovation was to let the river flood. But in the much later in Chinese history, there was the idea of levees only. We're going to keep the river, restrict the river to its river channel to have it erode its river channel. That didn't turn out to work that well. So successes and failures, I guess, is on the flooding front in particular. There's some interesting recent research, by the way, about if people are interested in Native American flood management, there's interesting research about the Mississippian mound building culture, particularly in Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis. And there's evidence that they managed kind of moderate level floods pretty well, but that actually there was one unusually large flood event that actually destroyed the city and ended up, this is all speculative at this point, but that ended up kind of dispersing that civilization for a time. So it's a complicated history that we are just starting to learn about.
Thank you. Dean Lindsay is asking about saltwater incursion. He says, what's happening in the forests that you showed on earlier slides? He's from South Louisiana and has seen destruction of cypress swamps. And asking what are the most vulnerable areas?
Yeah, so saltwater intrusion is a huge issue along the coast, and that has different ways that plays out. Often it's groundwater, where the combination of sea level rise and the over extraction of groundwater leads to salinization of coastal aquifers that people are using. In Louisiana on the lower Mississippi, there was a scare people might be aware of this fall, where the salt front on surface water in the Mississippi was moving up into the intakes of communities along the lower Mississippi, ultimately towards New Orleans. It never quite reached New Orleans water intake. So that's a combination of the kind of the push of sea level and the countervailing push of fresh water from the continent. I think my main advice there, kind of broadly speaking, is we can't do a lot locally about sea level rise. That's a global issue, and really, obviously reducing carbon emissions is critical to that. But what we can do is be careful about how we use groundwater and about local land subsidence. For coastal Louisiana, obviously protecting coastal wetlands from oil and gas extraction, from groundwater over extraction. These are all really important local effects. And now I should probably move to my part 3. I was trying to do like 15 minutes per, so okay. Let's go back to presentation mode. Okay, so Okay, so I wanted to spend another 15 minutes or so talking about another closely related issue having to do with flooding, which is the issue of how we live relative to floods. That first piece was kind of about how we manage, about the climate change aspects and about how river engineering, dams, levees, all that, how they change the flood event. And now what I want to do is think about, kind of how we are affected by those floods. And that really has to do with where we're living, a parameter that's called exposure. So I start with this same image, which seems to show, and there are other data sources that would show the same thing, that we're having more of these events over time, right? And since these are billion-dollar events, the other way to think about this is flood events are doing more damage over time. That's a common thing you'll see in a lot of data sets, more and more flood damage over time. So the problem's getting worse. How do we think about that? So I think it's important to recognize that when we're thinking about damage or the risk to people or society or infrastructure or property, we're really talking about three different things together. We're talking about the physical hazard, which in this case would be like the size of the flood. The size of the flood is affected by climate change, is affected by impervious surfaces, it's affected by river engineering. But we're also talking about exposure. Where are people living relative to the flood? And we're talking about vulnerability, which is really about how are people living relative to the flood. And I want to show you a data set that suggests that exposure is something we need to take very seriously. So this is looking only at US data and only at coastal storms, essentially hurricanes, tropical cyclones, and looking in constant dollars, so kind of normalized for inflation and all that. And you see this pattern that I talked about of like increasing damage over time. And I've highlighted on here some, particularly large events, Katrina, record setting, et cetera, Sandy. Okay, so this supports that narrative of increasing damage over time. But this is the same data set, but it's imagining that, or it's calculating the damage that would have been done if our level of infrastructure development, if our level of exposure were the same as in 1920 or 1900 as it is now. In other words, just looking at those Galveston hurricanes from the early 20th century and saying, how much damage would they have done if the population of Galveston and the property in Galveston were the current land use, current landscape? And what you can see here is that there's really no trend over time. If anything, the largest event here is the Great Miami Hurricane of 1929. The reason that didn't do so much damage is not because it wasn't a large event, but simply because at that point, we weren't, I'm going to use this in quotation marks, but we weren't foolish enough to think that we could build huge skyscrapers in Miami right on the beach, right? And protect those from storm events. So that's a little glib, and I recognize it's more complicated than that. But I think the conclusion you can draw from this analysis and lots of others along the same lines is that the increase in flood damage over time is caused, at least in part, not by a change not by climate change, not by impervious cover, not by river engineering, although those are important, but also by the simple fact that we are now living in flood-prone areas. Why we're doing that, it's a very complicated question, but at least in part, it's driven by the fact that we've tried to make those flood-prone areas safe, right? So that's what has been called the levee effect. Gilbert White, I think, was the first person to use that term. But to me, anyway, what that means is the fact that we build levees to make areas safe for development, and then we develop those areas. And then when the levees fail, those areas are more vulnerable. So we increase our population and our property in flood-prone areas simply by the fact that we pretend they are no longer flood-prone. There's another whole aspect of this which has to do with the National Flood Insurance Program, with our economic system, with the high value of seaside property by the increase in tourism and the way that can drive regional economies. But in any case, I think this is a problem, right? We are increasing our exposure. And if you kind of project this into the future, this is a really great detailed study of the distribution of flooding in the US and how it's changing over time. And what I'm graphing for you here is the population numbers that are exposed on an annual basis to flooding. So this is average on an average year, how many people are going to be how many people's homes are going to be flooded. In 2020, kind of the baseline here, it's around almost 4 million people. By 2050, there's going to be an increase to, about 7 million people. But most of that increase, some of that is climate change, which I'm abbreviating here, CC. But most of that increase is actually simply driven by population growth in flood-prone areas. Okay, so yes, the physical hazard plays a role. Yes, climate change plays a role. But there's something else going on here, which is that we're living in the wrong places. And this is a complicated topic. It's easy to say. I do think we're going to need to retreat from certain areas, especially along the coast. So managed retreat is part of the future here. But clearly, we should not be continuing to build in flood-prone areas. And on some level, the coast is the easiest because we know sea level's rising. We can argue more about which parts are more prone to river flooding or inland flooding. But along the coast, it's pretty easy to say this area is going to be flooded, and yet we're continuing to build there. And the patterns are very clear and disturbing. Okay, let's take a short break for a few questions, and then we'll come to the kind of drought part of this.
Right. Jonathan Lewis is asking, he says, since the American Society of Civil Engineers scored the quality of U.S. infrastructure at a C-, his question is, if municipalities fund most of our infrastructure, what does the score tell us about what may happen when a climate crisis intersects with a more vulnerable municipality that has less resources to respond?
Right. So the American Society of Civil Engineers gives grades to each type of infrastructure, right, including dams, levees, wastewater infrastructure, drinking water infrastructure, along with other boring kind of airports and bridges and stuff like that, which who cares about, right? The water stuff's the interesting stuff. And yeah, there are large needs for improvements on a lot of those. I tried to highlight for you dams and levees as particular points that when they fail, they can really be catastrophic. And there are lots of dams and levees that are not in the condition they should be in. But there's also other kinds of water infrastructure whose failure is can be very significant. Wastewater pipes that are leaking, drinking water pipes that release these geysers and also lose a lot of treated drinking water. These are expensive problems to fix, and you're right that the concern is greatest for the communities that have the least resources to fix this. I think the interesting question to talk about is the role of the federal government versus state and municipal governments in this. And people may be aware the federal government is stepping in a big way right now with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Lots and lots of funding for lead pipe removal, for water infrastructure of various kinds, and to their credit, I think the Biden administration is, in Congress that passed the legislation, targeting that funding at the communities that need it the most. So, yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of people who live in dam breach zones are not necessarily notified when they're buying houses or renting property. Tim Wood is saying that another market mechanism that comes into play in response to climate change is the insurance market. And do we know enough today to predict tomorrow's problem areas, wildfires as well as floods, and that will remain relatively low risk with respect to prolonged drought, flood risk, and wildfires?
That's a tough question, right? So insurance, the National Flood Insurance Program, for example, it's very data intensive, right? You have to be able to say, well, you're in a risky place, so your premiums are high. You have no risk. You don't need to buy flood insurance. And that is something that I should just back up and say, National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program to provide flood insurance, since private insurance companies generally don't offer that. It's seen as something that the federal government has to offer. And it is also seen as a way for the federal government to try to improve local land use, right? So, in the US, we're scared of having too much land use regulation, but here's a place where we really don't want people building in floodplains, right? We don't. It's exactly what I'm saying on this slide, right? We should not. There's got to be some mechanism in place to prevent people from building in these areas. So the National Flood Insurance Program was meant to be a way that the federal government could ensure that local municipalities pass land use regulations to prevent building in floodplains. That's kind of the trade for subsidized flood insurance. But again, data, you need to have that data. The federal government was supposed to provide that data, but hasn't really been able to do that very well. And it has taken lots and lots of money and decades to get flood insurance rate maps, firms, and they're still not being updated. They're not up to date. They're not graded at predicting climate change. There are other flood models out there, and particularly one called Flood Factor, which is now part of a larger effort called Risk Factor, which people may be familiar with, which is meant to help, both homeowners and land use regulators and, insurance providers figure this out, but it's not a simple problem. I would distinguish wildfire from flooding only in that flooding is really a federal insurance. Wildfire is more private insurance, but otherwise they're pretty similar. I'm not sure I answered the question, but I'm just agreeing with the question, I guess.
Yes, an anonymous attendee is asking if there is an agency or institution that's monitoring the current flood mitigation infrastructure being built, and whether these are designed for the correct amount of sea level rise, for example, the East River Project in New York City.
I don't know the East River Project in New York, so I can't speak to that. But it's a question of time horizons, right? So, depending what project you're building, if it's a 30-year time horizon, you're looking out 30 years at sea level rise. And again, sea level rise is the part we know the best. But even with that, projecting out 30 years, a lot depends on, what comes out of COP28 and what comes out of COP29 and what we do in terms of transitioning to cleaner energy. So we don't know what sea level rise is going to look like in 30 years. So again, it's a data problem.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so let me throw out the last piece here, which is really shifting to talking about drought, and then answer any other questions on that, or we can come back to some of these issues too. Okay, so I want to first just define what we mean by drought. And I think it's important to distinguish it from aridity. I showed you near the beginning a map of the global aridity index, places that are dry, chronically dry. Drought is different from that. It's a deviation from normal water availability, right? It's when you have less water than normal. You can have a drought in an arid region, you can have a drought in a humid region. It's all just relative to what you're normally at. The main place to go for kind of drought data for the US is the US Drought Monitor, which has a whole bunch of different indicators that they pull together to create this kind of map. And what's important about this is that drought comes and goes, right, in different parts of the country. Every part of the country can experience drought. Over the last few decades, there's been a lot of drought in the Southwest and in California. This is the current picture for what that's worth. Okay. I think we all have some sense of this, right? If you're counting on a normal set amount of water, Having less than that has lots of impacts. Just want to highlight right now there's drought going on in Central and South America, and these are some of the impacts from that. That just came across in the last couple months. So some of the obvious things you think of in terms of water supply, but these are maybe some of the less obvious ones, which is like if a lot of your power comes from hydropower, you got a drought, you have less power, right? So the energy and water sectors are linked in that way. And Ecuador is highly dependent on hydropower, so it's having to both cut back on power use and also import electricity from surrounding countries. And in Panama, obviously the Panama Canal is a big issue. So that canal actually runs on fresh water. It's not a sea level canal. So every time a ship passes through that those locks, there's water released from a reservoir out to the ocean. So as you have drought, you have less ability to move ships through. And then, of course, wildfires as an outcome of drought, which then have their own impacts. Okay, so along the theme, of this series of climate change, it's clear, broadly speaking, in terms of that variability theme, that everywhere is likely to see somewhat more drought because of greater variability. But these are the parts of the world where we're likely to see significantly more common and more severe drought. So these are areas where, in addition to greater variability, we're also expecting lower average water supply. So the system's getting drier and more variable. A lot of these are places that are already very dry, right? So these are places that are going to suffer from scarcity. Again, to bring it back to New Haven as our common touch point here, if you're thinking about Lake Whitney and you're thinking about the Regional Water Authority as a water provider, they have Lake Whitney as a water source, right? That's why that's not why the dam was originally built, but that's part of what they're using that for now. Actually, I should correct that. That is part of why the dam was originally built by Eli Whitney II. Partly was a water supply for the growing community around there, but it's also an industrial water supply for his factories and a power supply. Anyway, the Regional Water Authority has Lake Whitney as a water source. It has a whole bunch of other reservoirs, and they're actually in a relatively good position. If you think about climate change, and you also think about something else that I just wanted to mention because I think it's really important, which is that these stream flow regulations, we are increasingly becoming aware that if we take all the water out of a river for us to drink and water our lawns with, the river suffers. And so in Connecticut, we have these regulations that were passed in 2012, I believe it was, that are starting to take effect that require water companies essentially to release water into rivers more than they did before. So the Regional Water Authority is kind of, taking that in and saying, well, that's going to, affect our ability to provide water to our customers. So let's let's look at the last 100 years of water supply, including the pretty severe droughts of the 1960s, and think about how these new stream flow regulations would affect us. So the blue here is the level of water in their reservoirs, total, all their reservoirs, not just Lake Whitney. And then all these seasonally changing lines here, curves here, are different drought thresholds from advisory, watch, warning to a drought emergency. And you can see they do pretty well, right? They're actually pretty water rich. Part of the story here is that demand is stable or even declining in New Haven, partly because of deindustrialization, all kinds of other things, increased water efficiency, all that. But the point is they can meet these stream flow regulations without a problem, as long as they have Lake Whitney. If you think about the $20 to $60 million that I said it's going to cost to fix Lake Whitney, it does raise the question, would it make more sense to remove the Whitney Dam? And that's something that, is happening more and more. People may be following this summer, the dams in the Klamath Basin in out west were starting the largest dams in the country to be removed. That process is starting. Would you do the same thing here? Well, the answer is no, in part because of this graphic, right? In part because with Lake Whitney, they're doing well. Without Lake Whitney, they would do much worse. So you flip out to the southwest and the ongoing drought there, and there we have a much more serious situation. And a couple people, I believe, mentioned this in the comments. And climate change plays a very significant role in that. This analysis was done when the drought was 22 years old, and asking the question, is this drought going to continue? How long is this drought going to continue? And clearly, this is a model essentially which compares a with climate change scenario to a scenario where there is no climate change, and clearly climate change drives much greater likelihood of increased of continued drought. One thing that I think is important to think about here is, at some point, should we no longer think about this as a drought? I emphasize that a drought was a short-term deviation from normal. And that's important definitionally, and it's also important in terms of how we manage it. Usually the way we manage drought is by ensuring we have enough reservoir storage to get through it, or going to some emergency backup water supply, or implementing emergency drought restriction measures so people use less water. All of those things can help with a 1-year drought, a 2-year drought, a 3-year drought. But once you're talking about 30 years, you're really talking about a different phenomenon, a phenomenon that has been called aridification. The system is getting drier overall. Concept of megadrought is closely related to this. Sometimes people call this megadrought. I think the term aridification is more accurate because the system as a whole is getting drier. It's not just a short-term deviation from normal. It's a system that can't meet the needs on an ongoing basis. And that suggests that we really have to use less water, right? It's not just get through the drought. We really have to start using less water on a long-term basis. And here's where we kind of cycle back to the beginning. We know how to decrease per capita water use in cities. We know how to grow the same amount of food with less water. And just two very quick examples of this with data. Las Vegas is a desert city, still uses a lot of water, but it has, so people are right to blame Vegas for being water thirsty, for being a water hog, but they've really drastically reduced their per capita use to the point where even as that city has grown over the last few decades, the total water use has remained stable. Okay, and this shows what can be done, and I'm not suggesting they're done. They can keep on going, but we know we can reduce per capita use. This is mostly by telling people they can't have lawns, right? Incentivizing people to tear up their turf grass. On the agricultural side, I thought I'd show you this graphic, which is for US irrigation systems as a whole. The amount of water that we apply to fields has gone down over the last 50 years, from about 2.1 acre-feet per acre, these weird units that we use in the water world. In other words, on average, we're adding, in 1969, we added 2.1 feet of water to a field in order to grow a crop, and now we're down to about 1.5. So we're decreasing the amount of water we're applying to fields, and part of that has to do with the fact that we're using better technology, these pressurized irrigation systems, which includes both drip and sprinkler irrigation. Okay, so we know how to do this. But I think the last thing I'll say on this front, and then again we can have questions here for discussion. Just my take on this is that in certain regions, including California, the US Southwest broadly, what's going on is not drought. What's going on is a drier and drier system. It's also a system that has lived for a long time on groundwater, which is being used unsustainably, depleted groundwater. And we're realizing that that really can't go on forever because the expense of pumping groundwater from deeper and deeper is starting to catch up to us. So we have this problem of less water available, the fact that one of our main pre-existing sources has been overused, that's groundwater, and also increasingly recognizing that tribes have water rights that have not been fully used, and they have a right to, and we need to leave water in rivers too. So all those things are kind of coming to a head, and I think ultimately that's going to require us not just to improve our per capita use, but also to think about how we live in the desert. and I know this is, somewhat controversial, and maybe I'm out of my lane here a little bit, but I'm not sure that long term we're going to be able to grow quite as much food in desert regions. I'm not sure that Phoenix really is going to be able to keep on growing at the rate it's been growing, given these pressures coming together. Okay, so that's my presentation, and 5:15, great. So we have time for a few questions.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating information.
Thanks.
Christopher Fullerton is saying, the USDA recently released its revised plant hardiness zones tied to, first and last average frost dates, yet climate change seems to make the reliability of averages much less so in our new, more variable climate. His question is, are you seeing any novel cartographic tools or other models that better capture the challenges of significant increases and intense precipitation events?
Right, so there's really a kind of data problem here. How do you deal with variability? How do you deal with understanding what the future is likely to look like? And I'll say that the way water managers usually work, right, is how do you know, what the average is or what the range is? Because I think water managers rely on extremes too, right? How do you know what the 100-year flood is? Well, you look at existing data, and from that you calculate the 100-year flood. What else can you do, really, right? The problem is, again, if you think that you're looking at past data, but the future is going to look different from the past, then you need different tools. And that's sometimes called in the water world the death of stationarity. Stationarity is the idea that the water is very variable, but it's variable within an envelope that's fundamentally not changing. So the die is a 6-sided die. It's not a weighted die. But if we think that die is changing over time, right? Maybe it's becoming a 7-sided die. Maybe it's getting weighted towards the 6 or whatever. Then that won't work. How do you deal with that? So one way of dealing with that is simply modeling the future, right? We have these climate models. You can tie those to hydrologic models and try to estimate how that variability is going to change. There's a lot of interest in that. I actually don't think it's all that useful for right now anyway, for water managers, because those predictions are too uncertain. They have too large a range around them. I can show you one example if you want. Quickly pull that up. I'll give it 30 seconds to try to find this, and then I'll give up. But I think I have like a perfect illustration of that.
While he's looking for this data, I just want to remind everyone that the recordings of all of our webinars during this series will be posted on the Yale Alumni Academy website in the days to come, and you'll all be receiving an email notification when they are available.
Okay, here we go. Okay. I think I'll just share this slide here, which has what I'm interested in here. So yeah, this is kind of what I was talking about here, that you can, the 3 basic approaches to dealing with the problem you're identifying. One approach is to use models, as I just said. One approach is to kind of track covariates like temperature. If you know how temperature is changing, and which is simpler than precipitation, and you understand how precipitation changes with temperature, then you can model that, or you could just update as new data come in. But what I really wanted to show you was this example of an analysis of the 100-year rainfall intensity at the end of the century. Okay, so what we're trying to figure out is exactly what you're asking about, like what are things going to look like in whatever this is, 70 years. This is what we think it looks like now, right? This is the current, somewhere between 8 and 10 millimeters an hour. Using different methods, like different models, this is the range of predictions. Is this useful to a water manager? I don't think so. I mean, we're basically saying, depending on which climate model you use and which approach you use, that it's going to be somewhere between 4.5 and 18 millimeters per hour, right? There's just a huge range in each of these models. And then you look across models, got an even larger range. So it's a little depressing to look at something like this. And I think, my answer is, don't build something that is very dependent on the exact rainfall intensity, right? Which might mean overbuild, right? It might mean build something that's a little bigger than you would otherwise need to. It might mean systems that are more modular and decentralized. Like I think bioswales is a good way of dealing with this, right? Because as you put them in, which you can do really quickly, you kind of see how they deal with increased flow. You don't need to know exactly the rainfall intensity. So that's kind of the thinking that I would use on that.
Thank you. We still have several questions that we're going to get to. There are several on the topic of desertification and adaptation. David Vale is asking, what's your prognosis for desertification in poorer regions and the implications for climate migrations by vulnerable people? As some of you were here earlier, we discussed climate migration in our first talk last week.
Oh, I'd love to listen to that talk. I'm very interested in climate migration. It's and a lot of climate migration really does have to do, obviously, with precipitation and with drought and flooding, especially drought, right? And especially the inability of farmers to make a living in areas that are dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So desertification is part of that picture. I think that the term desertification, you may know, is pretty controversial because it tends to imply a one-directional change in which an area that's kind of semi-arid becomes desert in a way that's irreversible. It loses vegetation. Often desertification implies overgrazing as a driver, not necessarily, but often that's kind of the sense of it. And I think there's, that paradigm has been increasingly questioned whether that really is what's going on. And so I think some of these marginal areas are pretty dynamic, right? Depending on whether you got a good rainfall year or a bad rainfall year. That's not necessarily desertification. That's sort of a dynamic carrying capacity that kind of farmers and ranchers and pastoralists often know how to work with. But of course, they have other constraints, right? So yeah, I'm not giving a very satisfactory answer, but I'm not a person who sees desertification as a huge challenge that needs to be addressed like through planting lots of trees. I don't think that's the answer. I think it's something that already people who live in those regions are managing reasonably well. By local migration rather than international migration, by changing stocking densities of their herds, by encouraging the regrowth of vegetation.
Yeah. Great, thank you. A secondary question on desert living. Gary's asking, is there anything the U.S. can learn from Middle Eastern countries like the UAE and Israel on how to create sustainable development in these areas?
I'm not sure. I mean, modern Middle Eastern countries are very energy dependent as a way to make living in the desert sustainable. They're very dependent on desalination, which is very energy intensive. So there's that vicious cycle of, as the region dries out more and more and population grows more and more, we build more and more desalination plants, which drive climate change because they're so energy intensive. Now, there are some technological developments coming out of the region that are good, like lower energy desalination, like drip irrigation from Israel, like wastewater recycling, which Israel is a leader in. But I'm not sure that ultimately, I think there's some places that the carrying capacity for human population is we're probably exceeding. We're probably exceeding as a planet. We're probably exceeding in the U.S. We're certainly, I think, exceeding in Phoenix. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. That's a tough one.
Thank you. Now for our last question, I'm going to circle back to one of our earlier questions that was more generic at the time. Gary again is asking if we can retrofit existing systems and structures to adapt to climate change induced problems in a timely and effective manner, and what government or non-government organizations should be involved, and then how can we encourage this to happen?
Right. So yeah, that is the big question, right? Like we clearly need to change some of our patterns. And how do we, it's a very complex system where people are acting with different motivations and different levels of information. I mean, I think I come back in terms of how it happens. I tend to think of, kind of the 4 I's. We have infrastructure, right? We got to think about infrastructure that uses less water per unit activity. And or if you think about flooding infrastructure, we got to think about infrastructure that is just, kind of better at allowing water to permeate into the ground. So that's the kind of infrastructure I'd look at. The second I is institutions, how, and I agree that both governmental and non-governmental institutions are part of this. How do we work cooperatively across different levels of government and with industry and with civil society to share that infrastructure and make those decisions? The third I is information, right? We need to understand, again, it goes back to that data question of like, yeah, is this region getting drier or not? And the last I is incentives. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I do think that there is a role for pricing in all this. And again, it's complicated because water should be a basic human right. So we don't want to price people out of it. But I do come back to, like, we are wasting water in a lot of places because we don't put a high enough value on it. If we want to both protect human societies in dry regions and I think it's really important, and protect ecosystems, we need to make water more valuable.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think this concludes our conversation for the evening. On behalf of Yale Alumni Academy and all of our participants, Dr. Anisfeld, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening, and I'd like to thank everyone for participating. I'd also like to remind everyone that Dr. Ansfeld has a book coming out this spring called Water Management, Prioritizing Justice and Sustainability, if you would all like to be on the lookout for that. Are there any closing remarks you would like to make this evening, Dr. Ansfeld?
No, just it's been a pleasure, and thank you for all the amazing questions that I'm going to be thinking about for a while. So, and I look forward to reading the chat. So.
Thank you all for joining us this year. This concludes this year's Climate Change Conversation series, and I hope you all have a good night.